I walked up to Dennis Jones's assistant, and I said, "Hi, I'm Rob Carter. I'm the new director out in Colorado Springs, and thought I'd pop in and say hello." And she actually kind of lost the color in her face, and was looking at me like, "How in the world did you get in here?"
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. I'm delighted to know that this is our 900th episode. When we began our podcast in 2008, I would not have imagined hitting this milestone. Thank you to all of our guests who have shared their experiences with us over the years, to our production team for putting this podcast together week in and week out, and especially to you, our listeners, for joining us each week and contributing to this growing community. If you enjoyed the content, I encourage you to subscribe to Technovation on your podcast platform of choice and share it with your friends and colleagues who may find it of interest as well. Whether this is your first episode with us or your 900th, thank you for joining us. And we have an interview that is fitting given the milestone. It's with CIO Hall of Famer and 25-year CIO of FedEx, Rob Carter. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Well, I am so pleased to be with my dear friend Rob Carter here for this interview. Rob needs no introduction, but for reasons of politeness at a minimum, I will provide one. Rob is Executive Vice President, FedEx Information Services and Chief Information Officer of the company. He's a member of the 6-person executive committee, which plans and executes the company's strategic business activities. He also serves as co-president and co-chief executive officer of FedEx Services. He has won all sorts of accolades. He was a charter member of the CIO Hall of Fame, as nominated and awarded by CIO Magazine. He was Fast Company's Most Creative People's list. He made Fortune Magazine's Executive Dream Team. I had a small hand in bestowing the Forbes CIO Innovation Award upon him back in 2019 as well. And he's coming close to the conclusion of his 31-year tenure at FedEx, nearly a quarter century of that as the Chief Information Officer, among other sets of responsibilities. I think that if one were to say that he is the greatest to have ever had the title, there are very few people who would argue with that. He's much too modest to probably accept that himself. But Rob, suffice it to say, it's a great pleasure to spend some time with you here in your offices, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Peter, and we really are friends. We've known each other for decades now, and I remember so many great points along the way where we got to explore the topics of technology and business together, and it's my pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's a great pleasure for me, as I say. And I'm looking forward to certainly mining some of those anew, but also hitting some topics that we haven't had the time to cover before. And topics I know from you from private conversations, but would love to mine here on the record. Beginning with the fact that you come from a military family, and you were born abroad, born in Taiwan, if I recall correctly. You spent time in the Philippines. You spent time in multiple places across the United States before eventually making your way to Florida. Talk a bit about the role of being part of a military family and how that helped form you.
Well, I like to say I was made in Taiwan. I have a little tattoo that I'm not going to reveal, but it really was an exciting way to grow up, frankly, because we lived in unusual and different places. We lived in Taiwan, obviously, spent several years there, then lived in the Philippines for many years as well. And so as a kid growing up, it was really a way to have kind of a wide aperture on the world that we live in, because everybody didn't look like me or sound like me, and we had many great experiences in those places, traveling around Asia and Indonesia and all of the interesting places that I got to haunt when I was a youngster.
Yeah, interesting. And if you wouldn't mind, talk a bit about your parents and how they helped form who you are, and therefore who you are as a leader as well.
Well, my father was a 3-war veteran, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Started as a buck private in Italy, and was just a wonderful human being. He was a soldier at heart, so he put a lot of discipline into me, but none of it was anything other than helping me grow and mature in appropriate ways. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, but she was just a wonderful, wise individual. I think that I have so many little sayings that my mother bestowed on me growing up, and she was a life master bridge player. She was very smart. I remember her friends would always talk about what an outstanding bridge player she was. So I love the fact that she was she was also kind of the financial, manager of the household and taught me a lot about investing and things like that when I was younger.
Very interesting. You went to the University of Florida, where you studied computer and information sciences. What sparked that interest in you at that time?
Well, it's kind of funny because I went to the University of Florida. My father retired at Central Command in Tampa at MacDill Air Force Base, and so we were living in Florida when I was in high school, and it just seemed like the place to go. And I was fortunate enough to get into the university today. One of the great public universities around for sure. But I actually went there as a pre-med student. Believed that still to this day have a fascination with medicine, but it didn't go particularly well for me at that point in time. Chemistry and biology were handing me everything I could take, and so it was time for a change. And it was just one of those things where I thought, computers seem interesting. I had never, other than maybe a friend with a Commodore 64 or a TRS 80 or something like that, I'd never done anything with computers other than played a little bit of Brick Breaker or something. But all of that said, I switched to computer science, and it was a game changer for my life. Obviously, something that wound up being my calling, I think.
And I know you've told me there was a special mentor that you developed there. Actually, a gentleman, if I recall correctly, who's going to retire just a little bit before you, despite, of course, being your senior. Talk a bit about that mentor back at the University of Florida and the impact he had on your eventual trajectory.
Yeah, really special guy. His name was Dr. Sham Navate. Sham was a professor, an associate professor at the university when I took fundamentals of data structures, which was kind of the intro, actual weed out class for that particular line of study. But Dr. Navate really helped me. He was very young at the time. In fact, he told me later that was the first class he had ever taught at the University of Florida or anywhere. I still have the textbook. It's over there on my shelf in my office. But Dr. Navate really helped me make sense of compute, because at that point in time it was very abstract to me. Even things today that we all take so for granted, like files and records and fields and things like that. It made sense if it was on paper, but when it was, once removed into the abstract of compute, it took a little getting used to understand those fundamentals of data structures. But I worked with Dr. Navate on a couple of projects as an undergrad. He was doing research on the brand new relational data structures at that point in time, and we did some what was called VLSI, very large scale integration of relational data structures there on campus. And I also worked at the university. We had a significant data center for the state of Florida on campus. And so I managed to get a job there and spent my undergrad years working with Dr. Navate and working on campus in a data center.
Very interesting. And I wonder, there's a lot that is noted today that the pace of change is such that if one studies the equivalent degree, that the point at which what you've studied becomes irrelevant is very rapid. Have you ever reflected on how long did it take for the things you learned as an undergrad to have been outpaced, or the evolution of technology, how long did it take to render portions of that irrelevant?
I actually still think that the early days of compute were the fastest days of change, because everything I was touching as an undergraduate was proprietary. We were installing DEC VAX equipment all around the campus. I was a DECnet administrator, so I was dealing with all kinds of disparate telecommunications. And as we think about today, and as we've advanced technology today, all of that unique, proprietary, bespoke technology has sort of evolved into a dominant design of technology, which is cloud-based, internet-based, software as a service-based. So many things today are more consistent than they were in the early days, where I could name 20 different brands that are all gone because the proprietary nature of compute at that point in time, has evolved to now much more of a utility that we can all tap into.
Very, very interesting. As you reflect on your late days at the University of Florida and as you contemplated your career, how would you think you would have defined success? What were you hoping for in your career at that point?
I remember I had an adjunct professor when I was a senior who was a director of IT at a company around Gainesville. And he asked us to write a paper about where we would see ourselves in 5 years and 10 years. And I wrote a paper that said, well, I see myself doing a job like yours. And at the point in time, I don't know that there even was such thing as a CIO per se. The director of IT, working for the CFO was kind of the guy. And he was pretty critical of my paper, saying that my ambition was too high, that maybe I needed to set my sights a little more realistically. But that I did in fact see myself and was anxious to lead technology for whatever reason. It was something that had gotten into me at that point in time that I wanted to fulfill.
Yeah, and you would go on to a role at GTE. People might know it as a predecessor, one of the companies that would eventually make up what is today Verizon.
Right.
Talk a bit about some of your early experiences there, please.
Yeah, it was really interesting. At the time I graduated, the oil industry was really hot. There were a lot of my fellow students that were going to Houston and working for the big oil companies, and I did interview with several of them and had some job offers, but I just ended up deciding to go back to Tampa and working in telecommunications. It was really fortuitous for me because the oil industry in the mid 80s, in 83 or so, really blew up, and a lot of those people got laid off because of the oil embargo and different things that happened. Some people may remember, but I was at that point in time building my career in telecommunications, and I still to this day love telecom. But I was an early DBA and an assistant programmer when I started, and so I was laying down code and then ultimately working with data and data structures, which was something that I still owed to Dr. Navate, and a fascination that I had about how to organize data. But that company was really a fascinating company. Was a pretty scaled company, and like you said, just a few years later, it would become Verizon. But it was also going through a significant set of challenges because of what was called the consent decree, where all the Bell companies had been broken up, and long distance, as we called it then, was separate from local telephony. And so I was working on all new billing systems and ways of doing the settlements between long distance carriers like Sprint and MCI at the time, and the local telephone carriers. Didn't have cell phones, but you'd pick up a wireline phone and talk. But super interesting, scaled development, high performance, always on compute that I found fascinating and learned a lot from them for sure.
And who were some of your mentors there, if you don't mind my asking?
My very first manager is someone that I'm still in touch with, and in spite of the fact that he was a Florida State Seminole, he actually liked me as a Gator. But Lanny just sent me an email the other day just saying he'd heard that I was retiring, and he was proud of the role that he had played. But Lanny was an extraordinary guy. There was a guy that sort of led technology for the business unit that I was in, named Frank Zackrell, that passed away a few years ago. But Frank was an amazing guy, and one of the most amazing, I'll call it kicks in the rear that I ever got was from Frank, that would really set my career on the right trajectory.
And can you describe that? Did he?
Yeah.
What required the kick?
So Frank had sponsored me for a job in our larger scale systems development organization that supported all parts of that company, and I was sort of a local developer and development manager at that point in time. And so he had sponsored me for this job, trying to really move my career forward. And I interviewed for the job, and they made me the offer, and I turned it down. And I got this call from Frank. I was working in downtown Tampa, and it was a 40-story tower that was the GTE entity. And so I go up to the 40th floor where Frank sits, and I walked in there, and I thought he was going to tell me, I'm really glad you're staying. Thanks, for this. And I walked in the door, and the first thing he said was, "I've overestimated you." He goes, "You're obviously far too comfortable in your role, and here we're sponsoring this opportunity for you to go learn and grow and do bigger things, and you've turned it down, and I think you've made a terrible mistake." And what you should do is call them up immediately and tell them you've made a mistake and go take that job. So I left there with my tail between my legs, really stinging, because he was a friend and a mentor, and he was just plain mad. But I did exactly what he said. I went out, I called him back, I took the opportunity to go into what was the larger scaled development organization, started really doing scaled development at that point in time, and owed Frank a lot for pushing me out of my comfort zone. I was very comfortable doing what I was doing, and I was actually good at it, but his coaching, was kind of being grabbed by the face mask, was exactly what I needed to open up my aperture. And so I learned a lot about really scaled development in that next part of my career, and fairly quickly progressed to becoming a director and leading a fairly large team when I was in my late 20s at that point in time.
That's fantastic. And so it was 1993 that you joined FedEx.
Right.
And how did you find them? How did they find you?
Well, they did find me. It was a headhunter who was trying to get to me, and I loved my work. They had treated me very well. I was, at that point in time, I transitioned to where I was doing all the client server development for GTE at that point in time, which was really cool next generation technology. And so this headhunter had figured out a way to get into our voicemail system without going through my assistant, because I had told her, I don't want to talk to this guy. I don't want to talk to these headhunters. They're bothering me. Well, he got this message in there, and he convinced me to talk to him. I had just finished my MBA, and we had studied FedEx as a strategic user of information technology. And so I didn't even know who he was representing, because he wouldn't tell me until I had dinner with him. And when I had dinner with him, he told me, look, FedEx is interested. They're going through, some transformational work where client server and distributed technology is an important part of what they're doing. So I got the opportunity to talk to him about it, and then ultimately decided to take the job, even though, it'd be what you would call a lateral job. I went from being a director there to being a director at FedEx, but moving out to Colorado Springs, where we were doing a lot of the tracking systems and handhelds and things like that.
And the company then, you've shared so many anecdotes about how remarkably tech forward the organization was, how forward thinking the executive team was, starting with Fred Smith. The whole notion that information about the package is as important as the package itself. I'd known that quote since maybe before I knew you, but I didn't realize he said that in 1978, which is remarkably forward thinking. Talk a bit about those early impressions of the role of technology once you hit the ground in Colorado Springs.
Well, I was moving from a pretty staid, mature company at, what had just become Verizon to, at that point in time, a 20-year-old company. FedEx was 20 years old and was venturing into all kinds of innovative ways of utilizing technology to manage the business and connect with customers. Just fascinating stuff. But frankly, I thought that we were crazy, that we were just sort of cowboys. When I landed in Colorado Springs, I was managing teams that were, really just kind of slinging code and doing things that was very different than the SEI level 3 world that I had come from, where everything was bolted down and tied down. And both companies were good, but this was more like a startup. This was much more entrepreneurial. This was leaning into new ways of thinking about compute. And the team members were so dedicated and so inspired to go do the next thing that even though it was a little bit, reckless at times, they were so on it that it always worked, and it was always capable of supporting what then and still today was a very fast-growing business.
Do you recall, what was the size of the company when you joined? Revenue, people, anything that you happen to remember from back in those days?
Yeah, we were about $8 billion at the time. I can't quite remember how many people there were, but it was already up well over 100,000 team members at that point in time. Because we were expanding, we were growing fast, but compared to where we are today, which is effectively 10 times that size, not in numbers of people, but in revenue and in the number of shipments and the things that we do to manage the connectivity of commerce all over the world.
Very interesting. Talk a bit about your progression from your first role to eventually the CTO position. That transition happened remarkably rapidly. What were some of the difference makers along the way that allowed you to achieve such heights?
Yeah, I'll tell a little bit of a story about that
Please.
because it was just kind of an interesting thing. I had just joined the company as a director out in Colorado Springs, and I was in Memphis. It was a normal thing to be in Memphis because that was the headquarters. Colorado Springs was a development center, but I hadn't met the CIO at that point in time. I worked for one of the VPs that reported to Dennis Jones, who was the CIO, and so I just got it in my head I was going to go introduce myself. Frankly and honestly, it wasn't, something where I was trying to self-promote. It just felt to me this was my boss's boss. I should go, introduce myself. I was the new kid out in Colorado Springs. And so I asked what building they worked in. It happened to be the building that Fred Smith and everybody worked in. We were all scattered around the airport at that point in time. So I went over, and the receptionist downstairs and said, was there. And I said, I'm here to see Dennis Jones. And I had a badge, and she let me in, which probably was my first real break there because she wasn't really supposed to. She was supposed to check and see if I had an appointment. But I went up to the fourth floor, which is where they all sat, and I walked up to Dennis Jones's assistant, and I said, "Hi, I'm Rob Carter. I'm the new director out in Colorado Springs, and I haven't ever met Dennis, and I was just in the area. I thought I'd pop in and say hello." And she actually kind of lost the color in her face, and was looking at me like, "How in the world did you get in here?" But fortunately, Dennis was in his office and heard me and stuck his head out and said, "Rob, come on in." And we talked for 45 minutes or so. We had a wonderful conversation, and I wasn't thinking anything about it. But 2 weeks after that, I'd only been with the company a little over a month. 2 weeks after that, one of his VPs resigned to go be the CIO at Limited Brands. And so Dennis called me up and he said, "Rob, I'd like for you to put your name in to the hat for this job." And I said, "Dennis, I've only been here for 6 weeks." And he goes, "Well, it'll be a good opportunity because you can go around and talk to all the other VPs, get a chance to meet them." And so I did that. And then a couple weeks later, he called me and told me I had gotten the job. And so, I'd been with the company right at 2 months at that point in time. And so it was kind of shocking, but I remember driving we had just moved into our house in Colorado Springs. We still had boxes everywhere. And the realtor called me on the way home. I had a cell phone then. The world was changing. And she goes, "Rob, I forgot my sign there. I think it's in your garage, and I have a housewarming gift that I'd like to bring to you." And I said, "Well, you can bring the housewarming gift, but you might want to leave the sign because we're moving to Memphis." It was the shortest I ever lived in any home. We stayed there for about 3 months while things were transitioning. But incredible journey to come to Memphis. I loved Memphis. It was really a wonderful opportunity for me to be here. And that was how it started, how the progression started. A few years later, we became FDX Corporation and bought a couple of other transportation companies inside of something that was called Caliber, which is what became FedEx Freight and FedEx Ground. And I was, at that point in time, had the opportunity to come to the corporate offices as the CTO of the corporation in late 97, early 98. So really just a fascinating, fast set of things that happened. But I just count myself, really fortunate. But you do have to, if there's folks listening out there that wonder about how to network, you have to be intentional about how you network. You do have to reach out sometimes outside of, comfort zones in a way, where people will know who you are. And again, it's not self-promoting. It's just business.
Talk a bit about Dennis Jones, if you will, the only CIO you've ever reported to before becoming one yourself. Talk a bit about his leadership style and what you drew from him.
Dennis came from the business. We had 2 CIOs prior to Dennis. I'm only the 4th CIO here at the company. So the first one was Jim Barksdale, legendary Jim Barksdale. Then Ron Ponder. Many people still, know Ron Ponder and know of Ron Ponder, two legends in technology. But then when Ron left to go to Sprint, I actually met Ron at Sprint when I was at GTE, because we were a minority owner in Sprint at that point in time. But Dennis came over from finance. Dennis was brilliant, really a guy that, I believe had a genius IQ, super smart, and he was progressive. He was the guy that was kind of saying, we need to break out of the mold. We need to go hire some people from outside the company, which is when I came to the company, along with a couple of my long-term colleagues here, sort of came in that early batch of people that Dennis brought in, the people who were doing things at consulting companies in different places that came in here. Dennis was my mentor and friend through those years. He left the company in 2000, and I became the CIO in early 2000. Dennis passed away a few years ago, sadly, but someone who left a significant mark on me and on this company.
You briefly alluded to Jim Barksdale, and I know you've also spent time with him. Can you talk a bit about the template he set as the first of the CIOs?
Yeah, Jim was a brilliant technologist, obviously. I mean, the work at Netscape and McCaw Cellular, and since then in his venture investing. Jim's a unique individual. Gentleman Jim, we call him, someone who was much beloved. A lot of times after executives leave, everything's not rosy, the stories that are told, but Jim is one of those people who you would never hear anyone in FedEx ever say anything other than, what an amazing guy, what an amazing leader. He went on to become the COO of the company prior to him leaving when Ron Ponder was the CIO. But Jim is still doing well. I talked to him just the other day because we finally retired the mainframes here at FedEx. And I reached out to him and said, Jim, we finally turned off all the mainframes. And his comment back to me was, well, damn, Carter, I thought those things were going to outlive both of us. But Jim was one of those people that could always make you smile, always make you laugh, and someone you never wanted to let down. That was one of his key leadership characteristics. No one ever wanted to let down Jim. They would do anything to keep from disappointing him. And he set a culture in motion with technology where we still to this day strive to not let the company down.
And when did you officially become part of the succession plan for Chief Information Officer? Was it upon becoming CTO? And also, what sort of preparation did you do once that became clear to you?
There was never any communication to me that I was, a successor, potential successor. It was interesting to be the CTO because I was the company's first CTO at that time, and we were, trying to figure out technology direction for a bunch of disparate acquired companies to, how do you bring that technology together, which is, many people in the profession know, one of the hardest things you can do is bring together disparate technologies and architectures and businesses and have them work together seamlessly. So fascinating stuff, but it was actually, this was Dennis's office where we're sitting today. Furniture was different, but I remember coming in right after the beginning of the new year in 2000. We had just survived Y2K, and Dennis told me, he said, Rob, I went over to Fred's house this weekend and told him I was leaving and told him that you should be my successor. And so it came as a complete shock at that point in time, frankly, but it's something that, once again changed my life in an incredible way, because pretty soon I found myself in my dream job, which has been true for nearly a quarter of the century now.
So the early time frame that we're talking about leading up to your taking on the role is the first wave of the internet. Talk a bit about the impact of that on a business like this and how you rode that wave.
It was a fascinating time, and it was actually in '94 when I was in that vice president job, and we had a meeting with Bill Joy, who was one of the founders of Sun at that point in time. And Dennis was really good at this too. Dennis would reach out to companies because FedEx had a cool brand. We seemed to be able to build relationships with tech companies that were impressive. So Bill came to Memphis, and we were sitting in one of my conference rooms, and he said, tell me what you guys are doing with the internet. And there was this awkward silence in the room. I remember it's '94,
Yeah.
Netscape isn't even really out yet as a browser. And he could read the room and say, well, we need to get going. So I give Bill a lot of credit for getting us going. But we just turned over to the team, said, look, Bill Joyce said we need an internet site, so we need to go do that. And so they got federalexpress.com, fedex.com, all the domain names, they set it up. But the very first FedEx page was so fascinating, and it's part of this, innovative and entrepreneurial spirit here at the company. Without any real direction, the team that stood this up, we were already offering tracking information via dial-up modems and things like that with PC-based software. So a heavy client on a PC called FedEx Tracking. There were commercials on TV about it. You put the disk in your PC and your modem would warble and you could go light up some tracking information. So when we gave the team the assignment saying we need to go build a website, I imagine that's what we called it at the time. I'm not even sure we knew to call it that. The very first page they put up was a graphic that showed a package flying across the screen, kind of leaving an arc behind it. And it was a little HTML format that said, enter your tracking number here, with a little blank, and you could key in your tracking number. And then it was an LU 6.0 IMS call in the background. I'd say that intentionally, not expecting everyone to know what that was, but it was how we were doing tracking at that point in time, a big IMS region on System 390 mainframes. And so it would send a call off to the same mainframe that we used for customer service and for that PC software, and it would send back the tracking results. We would reformat it into an HTML page and pop it out there. And so we won a Smithsonian Award for that because it was the first transactional website that anyone can find for business transactions, because e-commerce wasn't really a thing yet. There wasn't, most of the web pages that were out there were about pages, where you had a message from the CEO and a picture of headquarters. So really proud of that, not because I did any of it, but because, empowering a team, to go do what they know how to do led to an innovation that we think was really important for business.
And was that a difficult case to make? Especially you talk about the fact that in essence you're bleeding edge. It's not like you're saying, well, others have tried this and it's worked and it's not hurt their brand. There weren't undue risks in so doing. Was this something that needed to be pushed, or was it something that was pulled? Or
it was absolutely pulled, because we were, like I said, we were already doing tracking, on PCs and things like that. So this appeared to just be another version of that was suitable. But even prior to that, before me coming to the company, when I was working on my master's degree, my MBA, we studied FedEx, and we studied, American Airlines and Sabre, and we studied American Hospital Supply, companies that were turning their systems inside out and offering information to customers in a unique way. Prior to that, you had to either read your bill or call customer service or whatever. There was no systems interaction with customers, prior to that first wave of things that was happening in the early 90s. And so we were part of the vanguard that was really leading the way to, customer empowered self-service would be one way to call it. But it turned out that customers liked that. We still obviously had customer service where you could call, but customers liked being able to retrieve their own information. And of course, today we sit back and say, well, of course they do. It's the norm of the world, from every phone that we carry in our pocket to, every business interaction. But at that point in time, it was the leading edge of enabling customers to get access to information inside your systems.
very, very interesting. When you took over as CIO roughly 25 years ago, who were the people you looked up to? You mentioned, of course, great mentors inside the company. Who were some of the great CIOs of the day when you first became a chief information officer, or maybe even some you got to know?
Yeah, I did get to know a few of sort of who I consider the legends of the business. I got to know Ralph Sagenda was at GM. Randy Mott was at Walmart at that point in time, and they were part of a CIO group that I got invited to, a group called Research Board, at the time, which for me quickly transitioned to an organization called CIOs. But having a network of some of these legends of technology. I also got to know Jim Barksdale fairly well during those times. Netscape had been taken public. Jim actually joined the FedEx board, and so he was an important part of our board management at that point in time. We stood up, we were the first Fortune company to stand up a full-blown committee of the board of directors to manage technology. It wasn't just cyber technology, it was strategic use of technology as well as risk management for things like cyber. But Jim was part of that group, so I really got to lean into some extraordinary people. I also met Charlie Feld, which was an important meet for me at the time. And Charlie and I, to this day, are fast friends. We spend a great deal of time. I'll see him here this week, and the reality is having people like Charlie and Randy and Ralph and Jim Barksdale, to me, legendary CIOs to learn from and to listen to and to model after was critically important.
Yeah. We've only briefly mentioned a critically important person to this organization that I'd love to get your impressions of, and that's Fred Smith. Of course, as CTO and then as CIO, you would have a lot more exposure to him, presumably, than before your rise to those roles. Talk a bit about your early collaborations with him and your impressions of him as a leader.
So Fred is chief among my mentors.
Mm-hmm.
He's a leader's leader, just an extraordinary individual in every regard. But he's also, and he never will admit this, but he's also an information architect. And I don't call him a technologist. I call him an information architect very intentionally because he could see the future. You already mentioned in 1978, he said the information about the package is as important as the package himself. I believe that history will count Fred as the inventor of the modern supply chain, where just-in-time inventory and all of those kinds of things were all about visibility of inventory, not just at rest, where you could go lay hands on it and count it, but at rest and in motion. So the world began to change as the information about the shipment became critical to the way businesses operated. And so for decades, Fred could see a world where information needed to be turned inside out, where information would manage our business as it scaled. We were an early winner of the Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award here at FedEx, and the way that happened was that we used data and technology to do control systems that managed how things worked in our company. This was long before there were ERPs that would help you manage, business process flows in the company. But we were building it from scratch so that we could look at every package as it moved, at every plane as it flew, every truck as it rolled. We had put wireless technology in those vehicles long before the cell networks were available. We bought up 800 megahertz spectrum coast to coast in the US and put radios in our vehicles, not so that we could talk to the couriers that were out there, but so that we could move data from the edge of interaction with customers. We had handhelds that would go out and scan packages at the very point of pickup or delivery, and you would shoo that back into that terminal in the truck, and that data would then move into the core systems of the company. Information architect of the highest order, really understanding the power of information and how you could manage and grow a business with that. But maybe most importantly, just an incredible cultural and people leader. Someone that believed that communication was so critical to a workforce. We installed closed circuit satellite television in every one of our facilities around the world, and we had studios where we would broadcast to our team members so that they would understand the culture and understand the message. He started our people service profit culture that valued people and empowered them to provide great service for our customers, and that the logical result of that would be profit for the business, which would then be reinvested in people and start that virtuous cycle over and over again. I could talk for hours about Fred Smith and the brilliance of business leadership, entrepreneurship, but how many people, our company is really only just over 50 years old today and knocking on the door of 100 billion. We're north of 90 billion now, and it's just a really amazing thing to see an individual that could do a startup that the world didn't even know it needed and run it, manage it, and grow it to this point in time. He's no longer in the CEO role as of 2 years ago now, but he's still the executive chairman and still in the office pretty much every day.
Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. Talk a bit about the early days of your time as Chief Information Officer and some of the things that might have been part of your strategic plans, the first ones that you would have had your fingerprints on as the leader.
Yeah, so coming through the CTO timeframe at the end of the 90s and into the 2000s, it was the explosion of e-commerce for sure. So we talk about the internet bubble and maybe it bursting in the early 2000s because there were some business models that didn't make a huge amount of sense. But what did make sense was a connected world, and a connected world that would allow businesses to prosper and would allow people to thrive and communities to flourish. And so we were connecting the entire world of commerce at that point in time. Still absolutely true today. It was a sense of purpose that we had, that the world would be a better place if we could connect commerce and if we could connect people. We believed that trade was a harbinger of peace. One of the great Tennesseans who was Secretary of State many years ago said, "When goods cross borders, armies rarely do." And we believe that to be true. So we believe that trade is a fundamental empowerment for the world to be a peaceful set of partners around the world. But we also believe that the criticality of connectivity is important to people's health and well-being. So never more true during COVID, when we were delivering vaccines all over the world, when we were delivering oxygen concentrators, when we were delivering dog food to people's homes so they could shelter safely at home. The importance of what we were doing in the early days of what became the explosive growth of e-commerce was the thing that pops to my mind in those early days, because the company was scaling so fast. But one thing that was really true then, and it's still true today, is that the information intensity was growing much faster than even the package intensity at that point in time. People were becoming much more accustomed to being able to retrieve their own information, to create their own shipments, to do their own rating and manage their bills and everything else. So the information intensity was exploding through those early parts of the 2000s, and frankly, it still is today.
And something then, as today, as always, has been the necessity for modernization and making sure that technology doesn't become stagnant, that a lack of modernizing becomes the impediment to growth and being able to ride the waves of innovation. Can you talk about some of the changes in those days that were required in order to breathe life into the vision you just described?
We'd been really progressive even at that point in time about distributed technology and client server out at the edge, but it was a lot of unique systems at that point in time. And in the era of virtualization of compute and kind of the normalization of compute. So we had HP UX and Sun Solaris and IBM AIX, and we still had mainframes, and so every box was a little proprietary at that point in time, and systems lived inside those physical boxes inside of our data centers and out at the edge. But the era of virtualization and sort of the normalization of binaries that you could use across different kinds of compute was coming to reality. And it was really what I called the birth of dominant design. The internet was there as the lingua franca that connected systems. You no longer had these proprietary network protocols that were running out there. The internet became, and IP became the core way that computers connected to each other. But then x86 as kind of a computing framework in what were the earliest days of what would become cloud ultimately was happening inside of our company. So we began to move off of proprietary Unix platforms onto Linux and x86 architecture, which was a scale out architecture with virtualization. So applications didn't belong to a single box anymore. They lived inside of an environment where they could be moved around and scaled and descaled, elastically, based on the compute needs at the time. So the first big wave of modernization that we went through at that point in time was heavy duty virtualization. None of it was just, forklifting applications from their Unix environments into these new environments. We were refactoring them so that they would be, highly virtualized and highly portable. And that continues on to this day. I mean, we've gotten rid of all of that Unix. We've now finished our migration off the mainframes. But now that ability to move that kind of compute around also extends to the public cloud. So cloud native, for the next big wave, utilize those highly virtualized applications, but it made them much more, cloud native in their architecture so that they could literally be moved from our private cloud instances to public cloud. And that's the way compute has evolved now, is to be tap into capabilities where you can move to where the power is, where the compute is. And it's true for AI too, although much of that now happens on GPUs instead of CPUs.
And as some of those principles came to light, and perhaps some frameworks that helped guide your decision process came to light, it did so in a background within an organization that had a long history of acquisition and a fairly federated means of thinking about the use of technology, not necessarily integrating everything into doing the exact same thing or standardizing every last detail. I know we'll get into a little bit later in our conversation reversing course on that, but talk about some of the advantages and the rationale in having that as the guiding philosophy in the early stages of the company and certainly your period as CIO.
Well, it may seem counterintuitive to some, but when you leave business segments to innovate and grow and scale and focus inside of the very specific tasks that they need to perform, it is an engine for growth for the business. So one of the things that allowed us to grow so rapidly across those years was we weren't trying to do some big mashup that would blend everything together. And frankly, that's a suboptimal set of solutions. And especially when you're dealing with a lot of capital deployment like what we had, different sortation equipment, different physical assets that were out there managing what then was the networks of our business. We had the Air Express network, the ground network, the freight network. We had Kinko's, which became FedEx Office, and supply chain, and all those businesses had fairly unique technologies at the edge. But we were also doing a lot of things to bring the data into a common core and have what we called enterprise foundational services that would represent who the customer is, or what a package was, or what tracking looked like and shipment detail. So I've always believed that hybrids always win. It's never all of one or all of the other. But you're right. We had a pretty autonomous way of deploying technology into the operating companies. And I believe to this day that was what allowed us to grow and take market share so effectively for 2 decades.
So what changed? That philosophy did change, and now, in fact, the guiding principle is one FedEx, and thinking about wherever possible, making standardization something that is part of the inherent philosophy. What was the driver of that change?
So I think that what happens in anything that you scale, you have diminishing returns. I mean, it's a law of business, the law of diminishing returns. And so the returns on our ability to scale began to diminish, and the value of synergies across those networks began to increase to where ultimately it became clear that the synergies now were more valuable than the focus and scale that we saw in independent operating companies. So it was really just, a couple of years ago we made the decision, and as of this fiscal year, where we're sitting at the beginning of it here, we are one FedEx now. We have done away with those operating company boundaries. We've done away with the shared services company, and we're optimizing everything across the enterprise. One of the most powerful tools in doing that was that data that I mentioned. What happened when we pulled all of that data into central places was that we were no longer dealing with, parochial systems and parochial views of those businesses. We had a holistic view of the data that created a digital twin for the entire business. And so using that digital twin, you can use AI and ML to actually show what it would be like if we were able to synergize the business and, eliminate redundant routes and put things together in the business. And it was clear that that was the path that we should follow.
That's interesting. The intermediate step between the sort of federated model to one FedEx was developing ideas around a common core. And I want to talk a bit about that transition before we get to more fully into our conversation about the present and even the future based upon the org design today. Talk a bit about that definition process. And one of my favorite stories that you've shared with me several times is the importance of ugly pictures and in making the case, because it's not an easy pathway. What you were describing was not a light switch. It was a journey, and an expensive one, a time-consuming one. Talk a bit about the way in which you sold that to the executive team and to the board ultimately.
Well, there were two really important ugly pictures, and they both had to do with systems and what I would call the accidental architecture of acquired systems and the disparate nature of them, but still trying to send out a common bill to customers, still trying to have a common experience inside of customer service, all of those things. So the one picture was a complete inventory of every system that we had and every interface that existed. And frankly, it looked almost identical to Katrina rolling on shore in New Orleans. I mean, it was a hurricane. In fact, Fred coined that picture, Hurricane Rob. But I showed it to my business partners with great intentionality and say, if you wonder why this seems complex and why we talk about the complexities, this is your answer. The solve for is kind of mind-numbing with all this complexity. We have to begin to unwind this complexity. And so that was where we came up with the central core that would sort of be a brokering system between what customers saw and could do and what the operational systems and companies would have to do to execute and fulfill that customer need.
And some of the philosophical principles that were developed then, as I recall, were simplification and certainly a dedication towards the cloud. Talk a bit about that evolution. The cloud had evolved. Surely you'd been cognizant of it and leveraged it in a variety of ways. When did it become apparent to you that the future needed to be sort of cloud dominance?
Well, frankly, it was the study of dominant design that I did when I looked at other networks and utility across time. Whether and the electrical system is one. We take for granted. There may be a difference in the way the plug looks in Europe and the way the plug looks in the U.S. But we take for granted that it always was that way. Well, frankly, it wasn't. It was a battle over how to get to alternating current 110 and a plug that looked like that. It went on for years and years with lots of competing proprietary technologies. And nowadays, we completely take for granted the dominant design, that I can plug my stuff in and it's going to work. Well, it also felt to me like that had to happen with compute. That compute would ultimately follow all kinds of things. The railroads, we take it for granted that all the different railroads could connect like they do today. Well, they're 4 foot 8 1/4 inches on center on the rails in the U.S., and it was one of the great competitive advantages of the U.S. It probably won World War II for us frankly, was that we could connect the industrial engine that was the U.S. to both the Pacific and the Atlantic in an unfettered way, because we had settled on a dominant design for the rail, which the rest of the world didn't have at that point in time, by the way. So networks have a way of commonizing themselves and being utility. And so it appeared to me, especially during that virtualization era, where all of a sudden we were able to see, one form of compute that could run all different kinds of applications and run them flexibly across different machines. It was clear to me at that point in time that compute was going to become a utility. I still absolutely believe that. We have a hybrid compute model today that says that even though we're running cloud technology, some of it runs in our private cloud instances because we run it so hot it would be very expensive for us to run it in the public cloud. But much of it became very apparent would move across that boundary and run in the public cloud. And the future actually has more of that, not less of that. That all the economics and FinOps of public cloud will become normalized over time, and that will be, in my opinion, other than maybe the very edge of compute, where compute will come from.
One of the many things I've admired about you, Rob, is your ability to draw powerful analogies. Your intellectual diet is incredibly diverse, and I get the sense that as you read books about things that are very different from what you do on a day-to-day basis from a business perspective, you try to make connections where connections can be made. And so these analogies are all very powerful, and you've mentioned several times, and thank you so much for going into greater detail about the notion of dominant design. And I wonder how does your mind work in terms of developing some of these analogies from history and drawing them forward as to their applications to something like technology?
I don't really know, to be honest with you. I do love to read, and I love to read history.
Yeah.
I like to read about, military conflicts. I grew up in a military family, but innovations to me are fascinating to read about. And, one of the books that really set that whole course of dominant design in motion was Stephen Ambrose's book, Nothing Like It in the World. It talked about the Transcontinental Railway. Mm-hmm. And how the Congress passed laws and all these things that happened that set the course for for U.S. industrial dominance through the 20th century in an incredible way. And it had a lot to do with that rail system. The tycoons of the era weren't the tech guys like we see them today. They were the railroad barons, and that's why train stations are so opulent, is because it's where all the money was, So working early in my career for a telecommunications company, I developed a fascination for networks. How do networks work? What is it about networks? And, Metcalfe's law was fascinating to me, how networks are empowered by the number of endpoints that they can connect. And so that also ended up being the story of FedEx. Fred's earliest design of the company was a hub and spoke system that could connect lots of endpoints very efficiently through a hub. We still operate much that way today, although there's a lot more than one hub. There are many, many hubs throughout the world and through the network today. But most of that thinking came from networks and how powerful I think they are. And that's the story of the internet and cloud as well. Cloud wouldn't exist without the internet. You wouldn't have a way to reach out and tap into it. It's the plug that you plug into.
And as you described the transformation that you just described, that the development of a common core and some of the necessary changes, how did you think about and how did you pitch this in terms of the time it would take to see to fully realize the value of making those changes?
Well, the ugly pictures were a big part of it. To say, okay, current course and speed, not a good plan. I mentioned that there were two ugly pictures. The other one was the telecommunications network, which at that point in time for our company was striated by the various operating companies. It wasn't a common telecom network. And so the pitch that I made was, look, this is expensive. It doesn't make sense. Information ought to be a utility, not a proprietary asset and implementation of each company. So we started implementing what we call the Platinum Core, which was data centers, networks, and data at its core, to be able to say, look, those things are a utility. They're not OpCo specific. And that was the ultimate, beginning of having the entire collection of data for the enterprise, not just pockets of data warehouses and data marts that represented functional and opco boundaries.
Well, what will certainly be apparent through this conversation, Rob, is that you are a fan of frameworks, that it helps guide your own thought process, but also helps another theme that you mentioned earlier, communication of that as well. And another one that I really love, it's sort of an extension of the dominant design, is the four horsemen, as it applies back to technology. And you've alluded to it a little bit, but I'd love to have you kind of provide your own description into the insight and who the four horsemen are, and maybe talk a little bit further about that.
Well, when I started thinking about dominant design and what it meant, and the fact that dominant design was hard to look ahead to, but really easy to look back on. In other words, things that today we take for granted because we're only looking over our shoulder, across the great struggles that had led to a dominant design, and whether it's the design of the automobile or locomotives, like I said, or compute. There's always a story that leads up to the birth of a dominant design that then usually spans decades, sometimes even longer. Flight was also another great example of that. Well, in compute, because I had spent time working in a data center, I'd spent time as a CTO, I'd spent time as a DECnet administrator managing different kinds of network connectivity, and I'd certainly seen a lot of proprietary compute structures in mainframes and distributed compute, all of those things. What I started to see was this birth, and it was still ahead of us at the time, of common compute frameworks. And it had to do with the actual compute itself, the CPU, and the operating systems and binaries which would run the code. It had to do with the network. It had to do with storage, because storage had been pretty proprietary too, and it had to do with software. So the four horsemen were compute, network, storage, and software. And it became very clear to me that they were all sort of zeroing in on common ways of delivering the utility of compute. So x86 was what was obviously setting the course for cloud computing and standardized virtual compute. The internet and IP had created a common way to connect compute all over the world. Storage had become pretty standardized and pretty utilitarian, and was readily available through those connections as well. And software as a service had become really important, not just in the way that we think today about subscriptions, but in the way that we think about sort of object-oriented software that was fit for purpose, that would just come in as a service at the right point in time. So we stopped building these huge vertical applications that had all four of those things embedded in them, and we started utilizing horizontal design across those four areas, so that software was in fact a service, and it was an orchestration of things that allowed you to take smaller pieces and put them together in workflows and in a horizontal way, instead of building massive vertical applications that were self-contained with their data, self-contained with the box that they ran on. And I really felt strongly that we were ushering in the era finally for what was our nascent world of compute into what you would expect from things that, like technology, had been around for several decades and were zeroing in on a dominant way of being delivered to the consumers.
And we talked about in multiple parts of this as well, the importance of communication. And I know Conway's law is another, oftentimes you will recognize that as an important principle that you adhere to. It's the link between communication structure of organizations and the systems they design, named for the computer programmer Melvin Conway.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about why that resonated so much with you, and how you've applied that in an organization like this one.
Well, Conway's law wasn't something that I knew about for a long time. One of my colleagues, Anthony Norris, brought it to my attention, maybe 8, 10 years ago, something like that. And it hit me like a ton of bricks that it was in fact a law, because we were dealing with separate operating companies that had separate communication paths and management paths, and the systems, no matter how hard we were trying to commonize critical parts of them, the systems were still following those communication paths and organizational structures. And as I looked around at businesses and talked to colleagues who also had multiple divisions of their companies, and who were wrestling with the issues of, do you consolidate IT and technology, or do you allow it to be out there as part of the businesses? It became very clear that Conway's law was very real. And so how do you figure out then how much of systems you can put into a common core, and then how much of it needs to be at a flexible edge? And it's where the architecture between core and edge, really started to settle in our minds here, that there were things that would be much better off if we could commonize them. But as long as the organizational structure was what it was, there were things you had to let flow down the paths of how that business unit worked.
Mm-hmm. So as you think about the changes that you've just described and the transformation that you were enacting, skill sets need to change as well, reflective of where you're going, not where you are, or certainly where you've been. How have you thought across your tenure about ensuring that yours is an organization that remains a learning organization, that the skills of today, people don't rest on the laurels of the skills of today or accomplishments of yesterday, but rather continue to strive for what's coming?
Obviously there was some intentionality to offering education, offering skill sets, hiring in next generation folks to be part of the team. But it wasn't as hard as what people tend to make it out. People's careers progressed in ways that when some of the older technology was rolling off the books, especially here at FedEx, we had team members who had been around for 35, 40 years who were ready to retire, frankly. And so there was sort of a natural evolution that took place for the most part that managed through that. But people that loved technology and people that loved our company had a way of evolving with us. And none of this happens quite as fast as we make it out to be. It happens over time, and it gave people time to transition their roles. But it does have to be intentionally. I don't want to make it sound like it was just a laissez-faire thing where, so we were intentional in how we communicated to the team, saying, this is where we're going. This is what our future looks like. These are the skills that are going to be most important to us. We still need people to fly those old airframes, but it was clear, to our pilots that we were going to retire the 727s, and the 727 equipment category wasn't going to be part of our future. And it gave you time to get, certified on either next generation aircraft or to roll off the books with those assets. Very similar with technology. As long as it's clear where you're going, it shouldn't be a mystery to your team what you believe the dominant design of compute is going to look like, and how the skill sets we're going to need to match that.
Mm. And how has your thought process about when to build versus when to buy evolved over time? As you've scaled, as some of the predominant philosophical points evolved, understandably, what sort of evolutions happened as you thought about that mix?
Yeah, the construct of core and context was probably the first big wave of that. Things that were context, like HR and financial systems, and the kind of the supporting systems that you would call, the main generation of context computing that came along. It became very clear that we needed to go to the cloud for those things. Although we were already PeopleSoft, we still had a lot of proprietary HR. We went to Workday, and that became a really effective way of doing that. We went to Oracle Cloud Financials that allowed us to keep the books and really reduce risk across, a lot of disparate technologies that had existed in those acquired companies. And so the build versus buy mainly started there. Much of what we do to operate the business today is still custom software. We have a large custom development organization. We spend a great deal of time managing the software that allows us to effectively operate our airline, connect to our customers. But we use Salesforce for Salesforce and customer experience folks to manage customer contact. It was just the right kind of mashup for us, where it wasn't that hard to pick the things that we would lean into that would be off the shelf.
The pandemic led to remarkable growth for the organization, understandably, as so many of the people's individual supply chains changed. So much now was needed to be sent to our homes as opposed to browsing stores, unfortunately for those stores, or other mechanisms by which FedEx would be used. It just exploded, and all of a sudden you went through a period of growth that was much more substantial than in the years prior to that. As I'm hearing you talk about the steps that were taken, obviously without a pandemic in mind or this growth to come necessarily in mind, it seems really fortuitous that you embarked on the changes you did to be able to absorb the growth. I mean, it stands to reason that with some of those changes, had they not been put in place, it would have been, let's say, difficult at the very least, and maybe perilous at the most, to be able to take advantage. Forgive me for using that terminology, but be able to absorb the growth that came. Can you offer some reflections about that?
Well, it's really interesting because when explosive growth like that hits a business, you can't fake it. You're either able to handle the transactional volume and compute, or you're not. And so much of what we had done to make the estate horizontal and have it to scale out instead of needing to scale up. So the proprietary technologies of the past, whether it was mainframe or big Unix, server arrays or things like that, were all vertical, and you would run out of headroom when you were trying to scale vertically. So almost everything we had at that point in time was already horizontal. We could just literally orchestrate increased capacity by turning a knob, so to speak, and improving the amount of access to CPU and compute and even network that we had to make those things operate. So we were able to do that. It wasn't something that greatly challenged us. The business had a lot of challenges on its hands because technology is one thing, but operating in a world that's stricken by a pandemic was very challenging at the time. But we're proud of the work that we did to support the world during one of its greatest periods of need.
Yeah, remarkable. You alluded to earlier a topic I'd like to delve into in greater detail, and that is the creation of Dataworks. This is an organization, even predating your time with it, that understood the value of data. And if anything, of course, that is even more greatly understood today. And I suppose as the philosophy of driving towards the one FedEx model, having taking complex sort of talent from a data perspective and even data streams from across the organization, means of governance and so on, consolidating that and harmonizing that to a much greater extent makes a lot of sense. Can you talk about the creation of Dataworks and the logic behind it and where things are now?
Yeah, it actually happened right at the advent of the pandemic. So it was the very late part of 19. It was actually a conversation that we had in Fred's office with Satya Nadella, Raj Subramaniam, who's the current CEO, and Fred Smith and myself. The four of us were sitting there talking, and it was a fascinating conversation to see some great minds begin to think alike. And I was a fly on the wall, trust me, in this one. But to watch Fred and Raj and Satya talk about the value of very scaled looks at the world of commerce and the world of how all the data that FedEx had would be so valuable in understanding economic trends, understanding the value of what this company does, and what could be put to work inside of large cloud environments. We were already really good at our big data warehouses. We had some big Hadoop, structures at that point in time, but what we hadn't really done was kind of gone all into one of the big cloud data environments. And so they were all good at that point in time. But the fortuitous conversation with Satya, and so we started right away. We started saying, okay, what's possible if we began to feed the massive amounts of data that our operational systems of interaction, and systems of record gather on a daily basis, which is terabytes of data, and feed it into a data lake in Azure. Also begin to supplement that with external data sources like weather and other airline data, all kinds of things which would flush out the ecosystem of what that looked like. And we decided that we didn't want to encumber that with sort of the traditional processes of systems development, and that this was one of those things that was best set up as kind of a skunk works on the side. And so it took off. It became very apparent very quickly, and we had a lot of resources coming in from Microsoft at that point in time, a lot of data science. It took off. My successor, Sriram Krishnasamy, is the guy that we tapped to go lead Dataworks at that point in time. And so it has exploded. The power of all of this data and the digital twin that it's created for the business, and what the AI and ML tools in that environment, and then all the analytics tools can tell us about ways to more efficiently run our business. One FedEx was born out of that ultimately, where we could look across the businesses and see inefficiencies and see better ways to do things. And so Dataworks became really, really important. We're bringing it back together now. It was separate from IT. And through that, once again, that same kind of scale and focus conversation we had about the operating companies allowed them to run fast, and what they accomplished was amazing.
Yeah, fascinating. And what other sort of consolidation has happened as one FedEx is obviously a corporate-wide initiative? How is that reflected then further into how IT is organized as well?
Yeah, so I've always believed, and it is Conway's law, that if you try to organize IT differently than how your business is operated, it was something that on happy days the Fonz called the Malachi Crunch. And the Malachi Crunch was the more, it was like this wrestling move, and the more you wiggled, the more it hurt. And so I always called that the Malachi Crunch. If you tried to get outside of, the strategic organization of the business and drive technology differently than that. It was before I even knew what Conway's law was, but it was because there was a law in effect. It was Conway's law, and you were trying to defy gravity by putting, systems and technology in a different framework than what your business was ready to support. And so, so now with, we used to be organized pretty close to the operating company boundaries, at least when it came to operational systems. Our customer core, order to cash, was organized with a single customer base and under single leadership. But the operating parts of the business were organized along the lines of those operating businesses. Well, all that's now coming together to say, look, the customer is still a single arc. The FedEx customer is unified across what we do, but now the operating parts of the business are coming together, and we're reorganizing our leadership team and the executive management of the business so that we have a seamless ability to operate for the customer and for the shareholder and for our team members.
In 2 years ago this month, Raj Subramaniam became Chief Executive Officer, as you've alluded to.
Right.
And so for the first time across your entire tenure, you had a different CEO. As you mentioned, Fred Smith still is in the office most days and still the executive chairman. But talk a bit about that transition to a new leader. He was a colleague of yours for 9 years prior to that, so a known commodity,
right.
and no doubt a strong relationship prior to his ascending to the top post. But talk a bit about the change.
Well, it was I had worked for Fred for 22 years at that point in time, worked directly for Fred Smith, which was, an amazing journey for the young executive that I was, and the opportunity that I had over the course of 2 decades to partner with him to grow the business and evolve the technology. But we turned 50 right around that time as a company. Raj was the clear choice for CEO. Raj had been in the operations of the business. He'd been in marketing. He'd been across many functions of the business. And it was definitely Fred's and the board's choice to say, now is the right time for Raj to go in there. And so I had a very clear and meaningful conversation with Raj at that point in time, 2 years ago. I said, look, in 2 years, I'm going to be turning 65. If you want me to, I'll more than happily, help for a couple of years to go through this transition with you. And so, Raj would tell you, I think, and I'm proud to say, that I've been not just the tech guy, but a thought partner for him, and strategies of the business. We did some really interesting things that led up to the One FedEx transformation. But at the time it was clear. But I also said, Raj, if you want to do something different than that, it'll be the easiest conversation you've ever had. I've had one heck of a run here, but it was the plan that we put a stake in the ground for, and the one that we're executing. And I'm proud to be handing off the reins of not just this organization, but the entire enterprise to such a competent next generation leadership team.
And among those is Sriram Krishnasamy, as you mentioned.
Right.
Talk a bit about why he was the logical pick to be your successor.
Yeah, Sriram is also the Chief Transformation Officer for the company, not just the head of Dataworks, and he'll be the CDIO going forward. And Sri is brilliant. I mean, just absolutely dim the lights brilliant, just an incredibly smart guy. But what became apparent to me was two things. One, that the transformation was going to be technologically enabled. So as the CTO, and by that I mean Chief Transformation Officer, the technology is part and parcel of making the shifts necessary to get the corporation to One FedEx. But the other thing that was very apparent was that the data and systems aren't something separate. They're the same. We had separated them for a lot of good reasons early on in 2020, but it was time for them to come back together again, because there's really an infinity loop that operates between the systems that create the data, the systems of interaction, the systems of operations, systems of customer engagement that create terabytes of data every single day, fed them into the data lake, created great systems of insights that were out of that. But by an infinity loop, what I mean is you've got to close the loop on that. Those same insights have to feed back into those engagement systems in a way that allows you to change the business, not just inform management or inform customers. You really do have to do something, powerful to create an architecture that re-injects insights into operational optimizations in a way that will make the business better because of the insights you've gained.
Very interesting. It's been 20 years since you first joined a board, that of Saks Fifth Avenue. And I don't know this to be true, but that you were the first ever as a technology executive to take on a post like that. Certainly the first I knew about. And thankfully there have been others who followed the pathway that you took a machete to and cleared for others to walk. What was it at the time? How did that opportunity present itself? Frankly, when that wasn't, yours wasn't necessarily the common background that most companies were looking for to join a board.
It's really interesting. So it was in the early 2000s, and it was the birth of e-commerce in a significant way. And one of my other great mentors, who happens to now be the vice chairman of the board at FedEx Corporation, was Brad Martin. Brad was the CEO of Saks Corporation at that point in time, a roll-up of regional department stores in Saks Fifth Avenue. But Brad happens to be a Memphian. He lived here in Memphis at the time, and we were at an event together and he started talking to me. He said, "How would you feel about joining our board at Saks?" And I was greatly flattered by it, but also really intrigued by it. I had sat on a couple of startup boards for VCs at that point in time, technology boards while I was CTO, but this was the first opportunity to sit on a New York Stock Exchange traded, board. And I jumped at the opportunity, but it wasn't my idea. It was Brad's idea. It wasn't a headhunter. It wasn't anything else. Brad said, "Hey, we're sort of struggling with what to do with e-commerce. I think FedEx, is moving a lot of this stuff." We did some amazing things at Saks to, really do what I think was the first omni-channel, inventory system. All, when you're dealing with high-end luxury things, inventory really matters a lot. And so we really consolidated the inventory for that entire enterprise, and then would pulse things out off of Saks.com, and in a way that was really efficient for thinly provisioned high value luxury goods. And I loved every minute of that, and still count Brad as a great friend, and he's one of our board members today.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned, you would go on to become in 2007 a member of the First Horizon Bank board as well. And you've mentioned to me that it was encouraged. There are a lot of companies and executive teams boards that dissuade executives from joining boards of other organizations, but you mentioned that Fred has always encouraged. This has been something he believes the company draws a lot of value from. Can you define some of what his vision there is, and what value you derive that you bring back to FedEx?
Certainly everybody's entitled to their own, their own opinions, but my strongly held opinion, and it's Fred's opinion as well, is that understanding other management structures and organizational structures and business models is a great way to gain insights into how business works and how customers work. So I learned a lot about retail when I was on that board. Well, retail ends up being a very important part of what we do here at FedEx, is fulfill retail shipments, whether it's directly to stores or directly to consumers. And so I learned a lot about retail models in that board. I learned about banking models, insurance models, energy models, all kinds of things from the boards that I've gotten to sit on, and they've all been valuable in understanding business at a deeper level. It's not just technology. And one of the things that I emphasize a lot with the board service I do is I don't show up as the expert in technology. I think that's a huge mistake on a board. What I do is I bring expertise to the board, because the whole board and the management team have to work together to do things like securing technology or utilizing technology strategically. And if there's someone that shows up kind of as the know-it-all expert, well, everybody either ends up resenting that person or just looking to that person to answer the question or solve the problem. And that's never an ideal management construct. Everything has to be put through the management structures of a business and of a team. And that team can be the board, and that team can be the executive management team.
Yeah, and today you sit on the boards of New York Life Insurance, as well as Quest Diagnostics, also the University of Memphis. As you think about the evolution of your time across 2 decades on the boards of publicly traded companies, you started to allude to some of the things that a technologist bring to bear, whether it's knowledge about cybersecurity, whether it's knowledge about innovation and digital customer experience, e-commerce, the various things that you bring to the table from your day job, so to say. Can you talk a bit further about how board experiences, or what boards expect? Granted, limited to 4 that you've been on, but also from peers of yours who have served on other boards. How those conversations about technology have evolved.
I've also had the great privilege of sitting in every FedEx board meeting since 2000.
Yeah.
And so FedEx was a model for me to use a lot of times in the way we thought, because we recruited technologists specifically for our board. So I don't think I was first, because we had Jim Barksdale and Judy Estrin, and over the years other technologists that sat on our board. But it was one of the great learning grounds. Is obviously you don't sit through all the committee meetings or all the executive sessions when you're management, but as part of the XCOM here, for all those years, I did get to sit in all the board meetings. And we were also the very first company to set up a full-blown committee of the board that helped manage technology. And so that was an important learning step for me about what role did management play, what role do boards play, and that's a very clear distinction. You know, you're not on a board to manage the company. You're there to advise. You're there to make sure that good governance is in place, and all of that was something that I began to learn from those boards that I got the opportunity to sit on, as well as the opportunity to be on the management side of the table at FedEx.
And is board membership one of the things you plan to continue to do, presumably in retirement as well? And are there other things you're hoping to, from a professional perspective, that you're hoping to add to the portfolio?
Well, I love board service. I really do. I learned to, I think be a good director. I mean, it's a skill like everything else. It's not just a switch that you flip and you show up and you're, there. And you really have to also take your time when you join a board before you get too vocal. There are a lot of things you won't know about a board when you first join the company. And so you go through a fairly lengthy learning process, and then over time, you're able to contribute more effectively because you understand the board. But I absolutely love board service. I've enjoyed it, and I have two great ones now, and the University of Memphis, which is I have higher education is something that I have a real passion for. But I may have capacity to do another one, but right now I'm saying no to everything as I exit my day job here at FedEx, because I want to understand what kind of equilibrium I have in my life with the boards that I have. I don't plan on doing another day job, that's for sure, but board service is one of those things that can keep you engaged with business. You get to really be around a lot of smart people. You get to learn a lot, and learning is something that motivates me. So hopefully I'll get to continue down that path.
You once said to me that the evolution of technology is like waves on a beach. They keep coming and sweeping away and coming again, and whether you like it or not. As you think about the waves to come, are there aspects of this that you're jealous that your successor will be able to lead through, and are there some aspects of it that you're glad that you won't be?
I often joke that I'll be offshore observing through heavy lenses. As they attack the lunicidal waves of technology, coming on the beach. But I'm not jealous about it, and in fact, I think I'll stay fairly current because I just have a lot of friends and a lot of interests in the technology. But I do think that it will be relentless, and what I think that I would offer as advice to anyone out there is make sure that you understand that standing still is more dangerous than you think it is, and moving ahead is less dangerous than you think it is. So you have to recalibrate your risk meters and recognize that standing on that beach is how you get swept away by the tsunami, of something that's going to come and just knock you off of that beach. But moving ahead is critical to the future of your business, your enterprise, and probably your life too. So I'm a believer that most people need to recalibrate those two dials. Back off the notion that moving ahead is risky, and amp up the fact that standing still is risky.
At a time where the average tenure of a CIO is something below 4 years, I think still, according to my friends in the executive recruiting field,
Wow.
You're more than 6 times the average at this point. And it's remarkable the change that you've led, change that as we sit here might seem like it's inevitable, that success was always going to be the outcome, but surely that wasn't the case. And in many cases, your peers would have come to that next phase of really hard change to come, and use that as an opportunity to find the next opportunity and perhaps leverage some of what you've learned in the next the next CIO gig at another place, for example. And it really seems as though from the early days you had a very long-term perspective. When you started, by the way, the average was less than 3 years. And so, at least as you look around your peers, you wouldn't have necessarily known that yours would be such a long tenure. I wonder, what is it about your makeup that had you thinking so long, and frankly kept you so loyal to the organization through a lot of difficult change that you had to usher in?
Yeah, I think you used the key word at the end there, loyalty. And loyalty is never a one-way street. Loyalty is a two-way street. And so one of the things that I admire most about Fred Smith is he's very loyal. I mean, there's a relationship that you can form that is about mutual respect and mutual loyalty to the enterprise. And so, you know, in my way of thinking about it, it was purpose driven. So the purpose that we have here to connect the world and connect people and possibilities was something that has kept me motivated for decades now, more than 3. I've found it fascinating to be part of a company that matters in the world, that is in fact changing what's possible in the world. And so that was hugely motivating to me, and it caused me to be invigorated by it. But the loyalty comes from, a culture where people matter, a culture where relationships matter, a culture where people care. And so that's what's kept me here. And I've been fortunate enough that they were willing to put up with me for so long. I still kind of shake my head because it's flown by. But the reality is it was totally mutual along the way. And I didn't have a big itch that I wanted to scratch somewhere else. I mean, I think, and I would say this, I think that people often conflate two things that are very, very different. And that is the difference between contentment and complacency. And they're not the same thing at all. Complacency means, well, I guess I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And contentment is, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing here. And so I've leaned hard into being content in this work. Very gratifying work, very fulfilling work, and I think important. And that just gives you the fortitude to power through, lots of challenges, lots of changes. It's a hard job. It's 24/7 by 365 and a quarter. Our world never shuts off. It's never a holiday everywhere. Weekends, in some parts of the world don't matter. Sunday is a business day in Dubai and the UAE. Our systems, never stop. E-commerce certainly doesn't stop for weekends. It amps up when people have time to shop online and things like that. So it's not that it's a easy job or that you just get used to it. It's really something that you have to continue to shoulder and lean into. But you surround yourself by great team members, by people that are capable of doing their jobs. No one can scale. If people say, well, how do you scale to do that job? I say, well, how do you scale to do Fred Smith's job or Raj Subramaniam's job? They've got this and everything else going on. You scale by surrounding yourself with great, competent leaders and trusting them to do the right thing.
Any other advice you'd offer? Seems like the entire conversation would be great advice for people to learn from. And you talked about some of the more specific advice of not remaining complacent, for example, in fact, the danger in doing so. Yeah. As you think about the CIOs, CIDOs, other people who will run tech and digital for large-scale organizations, other bits of advice that we've not talked about yet?
Well, I'm a bit of a life balance freak. So I do not believe that creativity or being at your best comes from putting your nose right up against the grindstone and burning it. I think you have to have other interests. I love to cook. I love the outdoors. I love to spend time with family and friends. I very intentionally invest in things outside of work, opportunities to refresh, to read, to do things, and not just reading, technical stuff, but reading fiction or whatever makes your imagination run wild. And so my advice is try and be as well-rounded as you possibly can. Have goals in each area of your life, not just in your professional and financial aspirations, but in your family and your social and your physical and mental and spiritual aspects of your life. Be intentional about setting goals in those areas, and you'll find that your life operates much more smoothly and you know, in a balance wheel that doesn't have a flat tire.
No, that seems like a great set of insights perhaps to end our conversation on. And Rob, as I mentioned at the outset, yours has just been a remarkable career, and to have witnessed it a little bit here and there, and having had the great opportunity and great fortune to have a regular audience and conversation with you on and off the record, and ultimately a friendship with you, has been one of the great honors of my life. And thank you so much for taking time today.
Peter, thank you. I've greatly valued all the work that we've done together, and thanks for this time as well.